The crystal champagne flute trembled in Margaret Harrison's manicured hand as she stood in the center of the opulent corporate gala ballroom, her eyes locked on the man she'd discarded 3 years ago like yesterday's newspaper, the husband she'd divorced without a second thought, believing him to be nothing more than a struggling middle management failure. But tonight, dressed in an impeccable Tom Ford tuxedo that cost more than her annual salary, Daniel Morrison stood before the assembled board of directors of Harrison Global Industries, the very company where Margaret's entire family, her mother Victoria, her brother James, her sister-in-law Patricia, and even her father before his retirement, had built their careers and reputations. Victoria Harrison, Margaret's imperious mother and the company's senior vice president of operations, had already made her contempt known by stepping forward with theatrical flourish, grabbing a glass of expensive Bordeaux from a passing waiter's tray, and pouring the crimson liquid down Daniel's pristine white shirt, while Margaret's new lover, the company's arrogant marketing director Trevor Blackstone, threw his head back and laughed with cruel delight at the public humiliation. But what neither Victoria nor Margaret nor Trevor nor anyone in that glittering ballroom knew, what Daniel had kept hidden behind years of careful misdirection and deliberate obscurity, was that the unassuming man they'd dismissed as worthless was actually the secret multi-billionaire owner of Harrison Global Industries itself, the phantom investor who'd acquired controlling interest 5 years ago through a labyrinth of shell corporations and offshore trusts. The red wine dripped slowly down Daniel's chest, each drop counting the seconds before he would reveal the truth that would shatter their world. And what Daniel Morrison did next would shock the entire board of directors, devastate Victoria Harrison in ways she could never have anticipated, and make Margaret question every decision that had led her to this catastrophic moment. But how had a woman so calculating as Margaret failed to recognize the quiet power in the man she'd shared a bed with for 7 years? But what could Daniel possibly do in front of the company's most powerful stakeholders that would simultaneously expose his true identity and exact justice for years of humiliation? But would Victoria Harrison's position, her reputation, and her family's entire legacy survive what was about to unfold in the next 60 seconds? The burgundy wine spread across Daniel Morrison's shirt like blood blooming in water, but his expression remained perfectly neutral, a practiced mask he'd perfected over 3 decades of learning to hide his thoughts from people who underestimated him. The ballroom of the Grandview Plaza Hotel had fallen into that peculiar silence that follows a social catastrophe. 200 of the corporate elite frozen, mid-conversation, champagne flutes suspended halfway to lips, all eyes turning toward the spectacle unfolding near the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline. Victoria Harrison stood with empty wineglass in hand, her face flushed with righteous indignation, her $5,000 evening gown shimmering under the chandelier light as she glared at the man she'd convinced her daughter to divorce. But Daniel simply reached into his jacket pocket, withdrew a monogrammed handkerchief, and began dabbing at the wine stain with methodical precision, as if this were merely an unfortunate accident rather than a calculated insult. "That's what you get for having the audacity to show your face here," Victoria hissed, her voice carrying across the now silent ballroom, each word dripping with venom that had been fermenting for 3 years. But Trevor Blackstone, standing beside Margaret, with his arm possessively around her waist, couldn't contain his amusement, his laughter echoing off the marble floors like shattering glass. "Did you see his face?" Trevor gasped between laughs, turning to Margaret with tears of mirth in his eyes, his hand gesturing toward Daniel as if he were a comedian who delivered an unexpected punchline. But Margaret felt something cold twist in her stomach as she watched her ex-husband's reaction, or rather his complete lack of reaction, to this public humiliation. 3 years ago, Margaret would have expected Daniel to shrink away, to apologize reflexively, to mumble something about not wanting to cause trouble before retreating to whatever corner he'd emerged from. But this Daniel, the one standing in the center of the Harrison Global Industries annual gala, simply folded the wine-stained handkerchief with precise corners and returned it to his pocket, then lifted his gaze to meet Victoria's with an expression that Margaret couldn't quite read. "Mrs. Harrison," Daniel said quietly, his voice carrying despite its low volume, the acoustic design of the ballroom amplifying his words to every corner of the space. But before he could continue, Robert Castellano, the company's chief financial officer and Victoria's longtime ally, pushed through the crowd with an expression that looked oddly like panic. "Mr. Morrison," Robert said urgently, trying to position himself between Daniel and Victoria, his eyes darting nervously between them as sweat beaded on his forehead, despite the ballroom's perfect climate control. But Victoria waved him away with an imperious gesture, her diamond bracelet catching the light as she dismissed her colleague's concern. "Robert, there's no need to defend this nobody," Victoria declared, her chin lifted at that particular angle she used when asserting dominance over subordinates, her years of corporate power radiating from her like heat from a furnace. But Robert's face had gone pale, and he was making strange gestures towards the elevated stage where the podium stood waiting for the evening's planned announcements. Margaret felt Trevor's grip on her waist tighten as he continued to chuckle, clearly enjoying the drama that had interrupted what had been, until moments ago, a tedious corporate function. But something about Robert Castellano's expression triggered a memory in Margaret's mind, a fragment of conversation she'd overheard 6 months ago in the executive washroom. 2 board members discussing the mysterious owner who'd never revealed himself, who communicated only through lawyers and financial advisors, who'd transformed the company from a regional player into a global powerhouse while remaining completely anonymous. "Mother," Margaret heard herself say, her voice sounding distant to her own ears, uncertainty creeping in for the first time since she'd walked into the ballroom on Trevor's arm. But Victoria was already turning away from Daniel, apparently satisfied that she'd put him in his place, her attention shifting back to the cluster of senior executives who'd been her audience for the humiliation. "Ladies and gentlemen," a voice boomed across the sound system, and Margaret's head snapped toward the stage, where Thomas Whitmore, chairman of the board, stood at the podium with a microphone, his expression grave and formal. But Thomas wasn't looking at the general crowd. His eyes were fixed directly on Daniel Morrison, and there was something in his gaze that looked uncomfortably like deference. "I apologize for interrupting the reception," Thomas continued, his silver hair gleaming under the spotlights as he adjusted his reading glasses with fingers that trembled slightly, but his voice remained steady and authoritative, the same voice that had announced quarterly earnings and strategic initiatives for the past 15 years. "However, given the circumstances that have just unfolded, I believe it's necessary to proceed immediately with the announcement we'd planned for later this evening." Margaret felt the cold sensation in her stomach intensify, spreading through her limbs like ice water in her veins. But Trevor seemed oblivious to the shift in atmosphere, still smirking at Daniel's wine-stained shirt, still riding the high of watching his girlfriend's mother humiliate her ex-husband. "3 years ago," Thomas said, his words falling into the silent ballroom like stones into a still pond, each one creating ripples that spread outward. But he paused, letting the tension build, his eyes never leaving Daniel's face. Harrison Global Industries was facing bankruptcy. The recession had devastated our core markets. Our debt had become unsustainable, and we were approximately 90 days from complete collapse. Victoria's expression flickered with irritation at this public airing of past vulnerabilities, but she remained silent, her arms crossed over her chest, as she waited for Thomas to get to his point. But Margaret remembered those dark months, the hushed conversations behind closed doors, her father's haunted expression during his final days before retirement, the fear that had permeated every department of the company. "We were saved," Thomas continued, his voice gaining strength, "by an anonymous investor who acquired 65% of the company through a complex series of transactions that our legal team spent 18 months unraveling. But this investor did more than simply inject capital. He restructured our entire operation, identified new markets, forged strategic partnerships, and transformed us from a dying regional company into the multi-billion-dollar global corporation we are today." The ballroom remained absolutely silent, but Margaret could feel the electricity building in the air, could sense the unspoken question that everyone was now asking. But Trevor's smirk had finally faded, replaced by a confused frown as he tried to understand why the chairman was delivering this history lesson at what should have been a celebratory event. "For 5 years, Thomas said, removing his glasses and folding them carefully before setting them on the podium. "This investor has chosen to remain anonymous, communicating only through intermediaries, attending board meetings via secure video conference from undisclosed locations. But tonight he requested to be present in person for our annual gala, the first time any of us on the board would meet him face to face." Margaret's knees felt weak, and she gripped the nearby table for support as the implications began to crystallize in her mind. But it couldn't be possible. It couldn't be Daniel, because Daniel had been a mid-level project manager earning $75,000 a year. Daniel had driven a 10-year-old Honda Civic. Daniel had clipped coupons and searched for deals on everything from groceries to clothing. "Ladies and gentlemen," Thomas said, his voice rising with formal authority as he gestured toward the center of the ballroom where Daniel stood, wine-stained but unbowed. "I present to you the majority owner of Harrison Global Industries, the man whose vision and capital saved this company and secured all of your positions, Mr. Daniel Morrison." The silence that followed was absolute, a vacuum that seemed to pull all sound from the universe. But Margaret watched as Daniel inclined his head slightly toward the stage, acknowledging Thomas's introduction with the same quiet dignity he'd maintained throughout Victoria's attack. Victoria Harrison's face had gone from flushed to ashen, the color draining so rapidly that Margaret feared her mother might faint. But Victoria remained upright, frozen in place like a statue carved from marble, her empty wineglass slipping from her nerveless fingers to shatter on the polished floor. "That's impossible," Trevor said loudly, his voice cracking slightly as he released Margaret's waist and took a step forward, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. But no one in the ballroom paid him any attention, all eyes fixed on Daniel Morrison as he began walking slowly toward the stage, his wine-stained shirt a mark of shame that had somehow transformed into a badge of honor. Margaret's mind was racing backward through 7 years of marriage, searching for clues she'd missed, evidence she'd overlooked. But she'd been so certain of Daniel's mediocrity, so convinced that she'd married beneath her potential, so eager to believe Trevor's whispers that she deserved better than a man who seemed content with comfortable obscurity. The flashback hit her with physical force, a memory from 8 years ago, before the wedding, when she'd accompanied Daniel to meet his grandfather for the first and only time. But the old man had been in the final stages of cancer, barely coherent, rambling about the family holdings and maintaining discretion, while Daniel sat quietly by his bedside, holding his hand and nodding patiently at whatever the dying man said. "My grandfather was eccentric," Daniel had explained during the drive home, his hands steady on the wheel of that aging Honda Civic, his expression distant and sad. But Margaret had barely listened. too preoccupied with wedding plans and career aspirations to care about a dying old man's delusions. Now, watching Daniel climb the stage stairs with quiet confidence, Margaret realized that those delusions had been final instructions, a legacy being passed from one generation to the next. But she'd been too focused on surface appearances to see the depth beneath, too concerned with status symbols to recognize actual power. "The board has requested," Thomas was saying, stepping aside to give Daniel access to the microphone, "that Mr. Morrison share some details about his background and his vision for the company's future. But I think, given recent events, some personal context might also be appropriate." Daniel stood at the podium, his hands resting lightly on its edges, and surveyed the ballroom with eyes that seemed to see everything and everyone. But when his gaze passed over Margaret, there was no anger, no triumph, no emotion she could identify, just that same careful neutrality he'd maintained throughout their marriage. "My grandfather," Daniel began, his voice amplified through the sound system, but still maintaining its characteristic quietness, was Jonathan Morrison, founder of Morrison Capital Management. But he believed that wealth carried an obligation to discretion, that real power was best exercised from the shadows, that drawing attention to oneself was the surest way to lose the ability to effect meaningful change. The name Morrison Capital Management rippled through the crowd like an electric current, and Margaret heard gasps from the assembled executives who recognized it as one of the largest private investment firms in the world. But she'd never connected Daniel to that Morrison family, had never thought to investigate his background beyond what he'd volunteered, had been too confident in her assumptions to question them. "I was raised," Daniel continued, "to live modestly, to work quietly, to observe rather than perform. But my grandfather also taught me that sometimes when institutions or people you care about are in danger, discretion must yield to action." Victoria had found a chair and collapsed into it, her usual imperious posture replaced by a slouched defeat that Margaret had never witnessed before. But her mother's eyes remained fixed on Daniel, watching him with an expression that mixed horror, disbelief, and dawning realization of what she'd done. "5 years ago," Daniel said, his tone becoming more businesslike, "I learned that Harrison Global Industries, the company where my then-wife's entire family had built their careers, was facing imminent bankruptcy. But I also knew that the company's fundamental business model was sound, that its problems were largely structural and financial rather than operational." Margaret remembered those conversations, the ones Daniel had tried to have with her about maybe helping her family's company, about having some ideas that might make a difference. But she'd brushed him off, embarrassed by his presumption that he, a mid-level nobody, could have insights that the senior executives lacked. "I acquired controlling interest through a network of shell companies and trusts," Daniel explained, his hands gesturing toward the presentation screen that was now displaying a complex web of corporate entities, maintaining anonymity to avoid exactly the kind of personal complications that might arise if my connection to the company became known. But I also did it to protect my investment from any accusations of nepotism or favoritism. Every decision was made purely on business merits, with no influence from personal relationships. Trevor had moved closer to the stage, his face red with anger or embarrassment or some combination of both. But security personnel had appeared from somewhere, positioning themselves strategically to prevent any disruptions, and Trevor remained in place, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. "My marriage," Daniel said, and for the first time, Margaret heard something like emotion crack through his careful, neutral tone, "ended 3 years ago when my wife decided that I wasn't ambitious enough, successful enough, impressive enough for her standards. But I respected her decision, signed the divorce papers without contest. and walked away because I believed, perhaps naively, that love should be freely given, not extracted through demonstrations of wealth or power. The ballroom was so quiet that Margaret could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears, but she couldn't tear her eyes away from Daniel's face, couldn't escape the weight of his words that landed on her like physical blows. During our marriage, Daniel continued, I lived on my salary from Harrison Global Industries, invested my trust fund distributions back into various holdings, and maintained the modest lifestyle that my grandfather had taught me was the mark of true security. But my ex-wife interpreted this as failure, as lack of ambition, as evidence that she'd made a mistake in marrying me. Margaret felt tears burning in her eyes, but she couldn't tell if they were tears of shame, regret, or simply the delayed realization of what she'd destroyed. But Trevor was beside her again, his hand gripping her elbow with painful intensity, his mouth close to her ear, whispering urgent demands to do something about this situation. I was content, Daniel said, his voice becoming softer, more reflective, to let her believe whatever she needed to believe to justify her choice. But I also wanted to protect the company that employed her family, that gave them purpose and identity and livelihood, because whatever my ex-wife had decided about me, her parents and siblings had always treated me with basic courtesy and respect until tonight. Victoria made a sound like a wounded animal, and Margaret saw her mother's face crumple as the full weight of her actions hit her. But Daniel wasn't finished, and his next words fell like a judge's gavel pronouncing sentence. Mrs. Harrison, Daniel said, his eyes finding Victoria in the crowd with laser precision. I want you to know that the wine you poured on me tonight did not offend me personally, but it demonstrated a profound lack of judgment, a willingness to publicly humiliate someone you believed to be powerless, a character flaw that raises serious questions about your suitability for leadership within this organization. The implication was clear, and Margaret watched as her mother seemed to physically shrink in her chair, understanding the threat that Daniel had just leveled with such quiet civility. But he turned his attention to the broader audience, his expression becoming more businesslike once again. However, Daniel said, I am not a vindictive man, and I don't believe in punishing people for mistakes born from ignorance rather than malice. But I do believe in accountability, in natural consequences, in allowing people to face the full weight of their choices. Thomas Whitmore had returned to the podium, standing beside Daniel with a folder in his hands. But the chairman's expression suggested he knew what was coming, that he'd been part of planning whatever Daniel was about to announce. Effective immediately, Daniel said, accepting the folder from Thomas and opening it to reveal official-looking documents. I am restructuring the senior leadership of Harrison Global Industries, but this restructuring is based purely on performance metrics, strategic value, and leadership qualities, not on personal relationships or recent events. Margaret held her breath as Daniel began reading from the documents, announcing promotions, lateral moves, and in one case, an early retirement package. But when he reached her mother's name, the ballroom seemed to hold its collective breath. Victoria Harrison, Daniel said, will be transitioning from Senior Vice President of Operations to a consulting role, working part-time from home on special projects that leverage her institutional knowledge while providing her more time for personal reflection. But her salary and benefits will remain unchanged. Her pension will be fully protected, and she will retain all the respect and dignity that her 28 years of service have earned. It was a demotion dressed in generous language, a removal from power that somehow avoided complete humiliation. But Victoria's face showed she understood exactly what had happened. She'd attacked a man she thought powerless, and discovered he held her entire career in his hands, yet he'd chosen mercy over vengeance. As for Trevor Blackstone, Daniel continued, and Margaret felt the man beside her stiffen as his name rang out across the ballroom. His performance as marketing director has been adequate but not exceptional. But recent market research suggests our brand needs a fresh perspective, someone with less attachment to our traditional approaches. Trevor's grip on Margaret's elbow tightened until she winced, but she couldn't bring herself to pull away, couldn't move as she waited to hear how Daniel would destroy the man she'd left him for. But Daniel's next words surprised her once again. "Mr. Blackstone will be transferred to our European division," Daniel announced, his tone remaining professionally neutral, "where he'll have the opportunity to prove himself in new markets, without the baggage of existing relationships and assumptions. But this transfer is effective within 30 days, and participation is required for continued employment with the company." It was exile disguised as opportunity, a banishment that Trevor couldn't refuse without losing his position entirely. But Margaret felt his hand release her elbow abruptly as he turned and shoved his way through the crowd, his face purple with rage and humiliation as he fled the ballroom without a backward glance at the woman he'd been dating for the past 2 years. "And finally," Daniel said, his eyes finding Margaret in the crowd with an expression she couldn't decipher, "I want to address my ex-wife directly because, Margaret, you deserve to understand something I should have told you years ago." Margaret felt every eye in the ballroom turn toward her, felt the weight of hundreds of gazes as Daniel spoke her name with the same gentle cadence he'd used throughout their marriage. But she forced herself to meet his eyes, to face whatever judgment or revelation was coming. "You were right," Daniel said simply, and Margaret felt confusion mix with her shame as she tried to understand his meaning. But Daniel clarified before she could spiral into speculation. "You were right that I lacked ambition, at least the kind of ambition that seeks recognition, status, public validation. But you were wrong about what that meant, wrong about what it said about my capabilities or my worth." The tears that had been threatening finally spilled down Margaret's cheeks, but she didn't wipe them away, didn't try to hide her emotional response. But Daniel's expression remained kind, sympathetic even, as he continued speaking directly to her. "I loved you enough to let you believe whatever you needed to believe about me," Daniel said, his voice carrying across the silent ballroom to reach her like a private conversation despite the public audience. But there was finality in his tone, a closing of doors that could never be reopened. "I loved you enough to honor your decision to leave, to not fight for a relationship you no longer wanted, to respect your autonomy even when it meant accepting pain and loss." Margaret's sob caught in her throat, but she forced herself to keep listening, to hear every word of this strange farewell that Daniel was delivering 3 years after their divorce was finalized. But she already knew that whatever he was about to say next would haunt her for the rest of her life. "But I don't love you anymore," Daniel said gently, almost apologetically, as if he were delivering unfortunate news rather than passing judgment. But the words landed with devastating finality, and Margaret felt something break inside her chest that she hadn't known was still whole. "I spent 2 years processing our divorce, understanding my own patterns and choices, and ultimately accepting that we were fundamentally incompatible, not because of wealth or status or success, but because we valued different things at a core level." The ballroom remained frozen, everyone watching this intimate revelation play out on a public stage. But Daniel seemed to have forgotten the audience, his attention focused entirely on Margaret as he delivered what felt like both closure and eulogy to their relationship. "You needed someone who performed success," Daniel said, his tone remaining gentle even as his words cut deep. "Someone who displayed wealth, someone who sought recognition and status. But I needed someone who could see value in quiet strength, who could appreciate discretion, who understood that power wielded invisibly was often more effective than power announced from stages. Margaret wanted to argue, wanted to defend herself, wanted to explain that she'd changed, that she understood now what she'd failed to grasp 3 years ago. But the words wouldn't come, choked off by the truth that Daniel's assessment was accurate. She had needed those things, had wanted a partner who would impress her friends and family, had craved the validation that came from being seen with someone obviously successful. "I hope," Daniel said, his voice becoming even softer, "that you find what you're looking for, that you learn to value substance over appearance, that you discover happiness in whatever form it takes. But I also hope you understand that sometimes our choices have consequences we can't undo, that some doors, once closed, can never be reopened." He paused, and Margaret saw him take a breath as if steeling himself for what came next. But when he spoke again, his tone had shifted back to business-like formality. The personal moment concluded as abruptly as it had begun. "Margaret Harrison currently works in our Human Resources Department as a benefits coordinator," Daniel announced to the general audience, and Margaret felt fresh shame wash over her at having her relatively junior position announced to a ballroom full of executives. But Daniel's next words surprised her yet again. "But her performance reviews have been consistently excellent. Her colleagues praise her attention to detail and interpersonal skills, and her direct supervisor has recommended her for advancement multiple times." Margaret's head snapped up, searching Daniel's face for mockery or sarcasm, but she found only sincerity in his expression, only professional assessment in his tone. "Effective next month," Daniel continued, "Margaret Harrison will be promoted to Senior Benefits Manager with a corresponding salary increase and expanded responsibilities. But this promotion is based solely on her professional merit and is completely independent of our former relationship or tonight's events." The ballroom erupted in uncertain applause, some people clearly unsure whether this was generosity or a more subtle form of punishment. But Margaret understood it for what it was, Daniel drawing a clear line between their personal history and her professional future, refusing to let their failed marriage impact her career trajectory either positively or negatively. "Ladies and gentlemen," Thomas Whitmore said, reclaiming the podium as Daniel stepped aside, "I think we can all agree that this evening has been more eventful than anyone anticipated, but I want to emphasize that Mr. Morrison's leadership has been nothing short of transformational for this company, and his willingness to finally step out of the shadows represents a new chapter in Harrison Global Industries' evolution." The applause that followed was more genuine, the assembled crowd recognizing the truth of Thomas's words, regardless of the personal dramas that had played out. But Margaret couldn't bring herself to clap, couldn't move as she watched Daniel accept the recognition with the same quiet dignity that had apparently been his superpower all along. As the applause died down and the gala began, transitioning back to normal socializing, though nothing about this night could truly be called normal, Margaret found herself moving through the crowd toward the stage. But she didn't have a plan, didn't know what she would say when she reached Daniel, only knew that she needed to speak with him one more time. Victoria intercepted her halfway across the ballroom, her mother's face still pale but her expression now mixing shame with something that might have been maternal concern. But Margaret gently extracted herself from Victoria's grip, murmuring something about needing to talk to Daniel, needing to say things that should have been said years ago. "Margaret," Victoria said urgently, her fingers clutching at her daughter's arm with surprising strength, "don't make this worse. Don't humiliate yourself further by begging him for another chance." But Margaret met her mother's eyes with a steady gaze that surprised them both. "I'm not going to beg," she said quietly. the words coming from some place of clarity she hadn't known existed. But I am going to apologize because regardless of what happens next, he deserves to hear that I understand now what I failed to understand then. Victoria released her grip, and Margaret continued her journey towards the stage, where Daniel was now surrounded by board members and executives seeking his attention. But as she approached, she saw Robert Castellano notice her and murmur something to Daniel, who turned to look at her with an expression she couldn't read. "Margaret," Daniel said neutrally, and the crowd around him parted slightly to give them a semblance of privacy despite the public setting. But his tone wasn't warm or cold, just carefully controlled, as if he were speaking to a stranger or distant acquaintance. "I don't want to take up your time," Margaret said, her voice steadier than she'd expected, despite the tears still wet on her cheeks. "But I need you to know that I understand now, not just about the money or the company, but about who you are, about what I failed to see when I had the chance." Daniel studied her face for a long moment, and Margaret had the strange sensation that he was cataloging her features, committing this moment to memory for some future purpose. But when he spoke, his words were gentle even as they maintained distance. "I believe you," Daniel said simply, and Margaret felt relief wash over her that he wasn't dismissing her apology as manipulative or self-serving. But understanding what you missed doesn't change the fundamental incompatibility between what you need and what I can offer, even now, especially now. Margaret nodded, accepting the truth of his words, even as they hurt. But she had one more thing she needed to say, one final acknowledgement that felt necessary, even knowing it wouldn't change anything. "You were a good husband," Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper, but clear enough for Daniel to hear. "But I was so busy looking for someone impressive that I failed to see someone good, someone kind, someone who loved me in all the quiet ways I was too blind to recognize." Daniel's expression softened slightly, and for just a moment, Margaret saw a flash of the man she'd married, the one who'd made her coffee every morning and left encouraging notes in her briefcase before important presentations. But the moment passed and his professional mask returned as he glanced at his watch with subtle meaning. "I wish you well, Margaret," Daniel said with finality that made it clear this conversation was ending. "But I have a company to run, a board to reassure, and a future to build that doesn't include revisiting the past." Margaret stepped back, recognizing dismissal when she heard it. But she held his gaze for one more moment, trying to communicate everything she couldn't say in words. The regret, the understanding, the acceptance that she'd destroyed something precious through her own blindness and vanity. As she turned to leave, she heard Daniel call her name one final time. But when she looked back, his expression was once again that careful neutrality he'd perfected. "The promotion is real," Daniel said, loud enough for several nearby executives to hear, clearly wanting witnesses to his next statement. "But don't ever mistake professional recognition for personal forgiveness. They're separate things, and only one is something I can give you." Margaret nodded, understanding the distinction he was drawing, grateful even for the clarity of knowing where she stood. But as she walked away from the stage, she caught sight of her mother sitting alone at a table. Victoria's imperious mask finally cracked to reveal the frightened woman beneath. The gala continued around them, but Margaret and Victoria sat together in silence. Two women who'd learned the same harsh lesson in different ways. That power recognized is less dangerous than power overlooked. That humility forced is more painful than humility chosen. That sometimes the greatest mistakes we make come from assuming we understand people we've never really seen. As the evening wound down and guests began departing, Margaret watched Daniel move through the ballroom with quiet confidence, accepting congratulations and answering questions with the same measured thoughtfulness he'd displayed throughout their marriage. But now everyone saw it as evidence of his suitability for leadership, whereas 3 years ago Margaret had interpreted it as evidence of his inadequacy for ambition. "I destroyed both of us tonight," Victoria said suddenly, her voice hoarse as if she'd been crying though her face showed no tears. "But at least you still have a future here, still have a chance to rebuild your career, even if you can't rebuild anything else." Margaret looked at her mother, seeing Victoria Harrison as if for the first time. Not as the powerful executive who'd always commanded every room she entered, but as a woman who'd built her identity on corporate status and was now watching that identity crumble in slow motion. But Margaret felt no satisfaction in her mother's fall, only a weary sadness at how much damage pride and assumption could cause in a single evening. "He could have destroyed us," Margaret said quietly, stating the obvious truth that hung between them. "But he chose not to, even though we gave him every reason to seek vengeance, even though any other person in his position would have been justified in crushing us completely." Victoria nodded slowly, her gaze distant as she processed the evening's revelations. But Margaret saw something shift in her mother's expression. Not redemption exactly, but perhaps the beginning of self-awareness that might, over time, lead to something resembling growth. As the last guests departed and hotel staff began clearing the ballroom, Margaret caught one final glimpse of Daniel in conversation with Thomas Whitmore and several other board members. But he didn't look her way, didn't acknowledge her presence as he departed with his new colleagues, leaving behind the wreckage of assumptions and the ghost of a marriage that had died 3 years ago, but had only tonight been properly mourned. Margaret drove her mother home through empty streets, neither of them speaking as the city lights streaked past. But she thought about Daniel's words, about the difference between professional recognition and personal forgiveness, about how some doors, once closed, could never be reopened. 3 weeks later, Margaret began her new role as Senior Benefits Manager, throwing herself into work with an intensity that surprised her colleagues. But Trevor Blackstone had already departed for Europe, texting her exactly once to blame her for his exile, before blocking her number, and she'd declined 2 invitations to company happy hours where she knew Daniel might be present. Victoria Harrison quietly accepted her consulting role, working from home on projects that seemed designed to keep her busy without giving her actual authority. But she attended family dinners with a new humility that Margaret's father noticed with obvious surprise, the dynamic between her parents shifting in subtle ways that suggested damage being acknowledged if not entirely healed. And Daniel Morrison, now publicly recognized as the owner who'd saved Harrison Global Industries, conducted board meetings with the same quiet efficiency he'd displayed during their marriage, implemented strategic initiatives with vision that earned grudging respect, even from initial skeptics, and rebuilt the company culture around principles of discretion, merit, and sustainable growth rather than flash and performance. But he never mentioned his ex-wife except in professional contexts, never referenced the night of the gala except when discussing board reforms, never gave any indication that he'd once loved the woman who now worked 3 floors below his executive office, carefully avoiding encounters that might make either of them uncomfortable. Margaret sometimes saw him in the elevator or passing in corridors, and they would exchange polite nods like the professional acquaintances they'd become. But she never forgot the feeling of watching red wine drip down his shirt while Trevor laughed and her mother stood proud of her cruelty. Never forgot the moment when Daniel's true identity had been revealed and the world she'd built on assumptions had collapsed. Late at night, alone in her upgraded apartment that her promotion had made possible, Margaret would sometimes pull up photos from their marriage, images of a younger Daniel with his arm around a younger Margaret, both of them smiling at a camera held by some forgotten friend at some forgotten gathering. But she'd learned to look at those photos differently now, to see the man she'd failed to appreciate, to recognize the quiet strength she'd mistaken for weakness. And she understood, finally, what Daniel had meant about doors that couldn't be reopened, not because he was cruel or unforgiving, but because real love, once discarded, couldn't be reconstructed from regret and retrospective wisdom. But the lesson remained, carved into her consciousness, like words etched in stone, a reminder that sometimes our greatest failures come not from choosing wrong, but from failing to recognize right when it's standing directly in front of us, wearing a wine-stained shirt and offering one last lesson in grace.